The teenage German prisoners braced themselves for punishment the moment the truck stopped. They had been told Americans would hate them. But instead of rifles and shouting guards, the men waiting at the ranch gate did something the boys never expected. In the summer of 1944, the war in Europe was reaching its most desperate phase. Cities were burning. Armies were collapsing. And thousands of young German soldiers were being captured as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied territory. Among those prisoners were boys who had barely finished school. Some were 16. Some were 15. A few were even younger. Many had been rushed into uniforms during the final months of the war, given a rifle, a few weeks of training, and sent to the front lines with orders to hold positions that were already doomed to fall. When they were captured, most of them expected the worst. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as cruel enemies who would take revenge on German soldiers the moment they had the chance. So when these teenagers were placed on ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, they believed they were being taken to harsh prison camps where punishment would replace the battlefield. Weeks later, after the long journey across the ocean and a train ride through the vast American countryside, a small group of them found themselves in southern Texas. The landscape looked nothing like Europe. There were no bomb villages, no ruined factories, no distant artillery. Instead, there was open land stretching to the horizon, dusty roads, wooden fences, and herds of cattle moving slowly under a huge, cloudless sky. The truck carrying the prisoners finally turned onto a dirt road leading to a massive cattle ranch. The boys sat silently in the back, their hands gripping the wooden sides of the vehicle. None of them spoke. They expected shouting. Orders. Guards with rifles forcing them to jump down into another prison. But when the truck stopped, something unexpected happened. The men waiting near the ranch gate were not soldiers. They were cowboys. White hats. Dust-covered boots. Sunburned faces. They leaned against the fence rails, quietly watching the truck arrive. One of them pushed his hat back slightly and studied the boys climbing down. There was no anger in his face. Just curiosity. The ranch owner stepped forward slowly, wiping his hands on a worn leather glove. He looked at the nervous group of teenage prisoners standing in front of him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the rancher finally broke the silence. "Looks like we've got ourselves some new hands." The boys didn't understand the words. But the tone surprised them. Because it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded almost welcoming. And none of them could have guessed that this dusty ranch in the middle of Texas would soon become the strangest chapter of their entire war. The boys stood in an uneasy line near the ranch gate, unsure of what would happen next. A few of them glanced at the cowboys watching from the fence. They expected insults. Maybe even blows. But none came. Instead, the ranch owner pointed toward a long wooden barn and gestured for them to follow. One of the American guards walked beside them, but his rifle hung loosely on his shoulder, as if it was more of a formality than a warning. Inside the barn, the air smelled of hay, leather, and dust warmed by the Texas sun. Saddles hung from wooden beams. Coils of rope rested on pegs along the walls. Horses shifted quietly in their stalls, their hooves tapping softly against the wooden floor. The boys exchanged confused looks. This didn't look like a prison camp. One of the cowboys stepped forward carrying a bundle of worn work gloves. Without a word, he began handing them out. At first, the prisoners hesitated. They had expected chains, not gloves. But slowly, one by one, the boys took them. Another cowboy led a group of horses into the open yard outside the barn. The animals were calm and powerful, their coats shining in the sunlight. One of the younger prisoners whispered something in German. Why are they showing us horses? No one had an answer. The ranch owner spoke again, his deep voice steady but patient. The boys understood only fragments of the English words, but the gestures made the meaning clear. Fence. Cattle. Water wells. Work. The ranch was enormous, and with many American men away fighting overseas, there simply weren't enough hands to keep everything running. The prisoners were not here to sit behind barbed wire. They were here to help keep the ranch alive. The first days were awkward and tense. The German boys worked in silence, repairing broken fences under the hot Texas sun. They carried wooden posts, stretched wire across wide fields, and hauled buckets of water to thirsty cattle. The cowboys watched closely but rarely raised their voices. When a boy struggled with a heavy tool, one of the ranch hands would quietly step in, showing him the correct way to use it. Sometimes they demonstrated the same motion 2 or 3 times, patient despite the language barrier. At first, the prisoners remained cautious. Every act of kindness felt suspicious. They had spent years being told that Americans were enemies who would humiliate them if they ever had the chance. But day after day passed without cruelty. No beatings. No shouting. Just long hours of work beneath the endless Texas sky. And slowly, the boys began to realize something they had never expected. These men didn't seem to hate them at all. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of ranch life slowly replaced the tension that had filled the boys during their first days. The work was hard. Harder than anything most of them had done before. They woke before sunrise, when the Texas sky was still pale and cool. By the time the sun climbed high above the endless fields, they were already riding out across the ranch with the cowboys. At first, the horses had terrified them. Many of the boys had never ridden before. The animals were huge, powerful, and unpredictable compared to anything they had known in Europe. The first time one of the prisoners tried to mount a horse, he nearly fell backward into the dust. The cowboys burst into laughter. For a moment, the boy's face burned with embarrassment. But the laughter didn't feel cruel. One of the ranch hands stepped forward, steadying the horse and showing him how to swing his leg over the saddle properly. The boy tried again. This time he stayed on. Moments like that began to change everything. Little by little, the invisible wall between prisoners and ranch hands started to disappear. The language barrier remained, but people found ways around it. Gestures. Smiles. Simple words repeated again and again until they were understood. One cowboy taught the boys how to spin a lasso, the rope whistling through the air before landing perfectly over a wooden post. Soon the prisoners were trying it themselves, laughing whenever the rope tangled at their feet. Another cowboy brought out a battered harmonica one evening after work. He sat on an overturned bucket near the barn and began playing a slow, wandering tune. The music drifted across the quiet ranch yard. One of the German boys hesitated for a moment, then softly began singing an old folk song from home. The others joined in. The cowboys didn't understand the words. But they listened. Night after night, the small campfires outside the bunkhouse became places where the strange group gathered after the long workdays. Someone would play music. Someone else would try to explain a joke using broken English and wild gestures. Laughter slowly replaced the awkward silence that had once filled those evenings. For the German boys, the ranch had begun to feel like a world far removed from the war they had left behind. No artillery. No shouting officers. No fear of the next battle. Just horses, cattle, dust, and the wide Texas sky. And yet, despite the growing friendships, everyone understood one thing. The war was still happening. Somewhere far across the ocean, armies were still fighting. And eventually, the day would come when the boys would have to leave the ranch and return to a Europe that had been forever changed. By the spring of the following year, the ranch no longer felt like a place of captivity. For the German boys, it had quietly become something else. A routine. A refuge. Even a strange kind of home. They knew the land now, the long fence lines stretching across the fields, the watering wells scattered across the pastures, the dusty trails the cattle followed at sunset. Some of the boys had become skilled riders. Others were trusted to repair fences on their own or help guide the cattle during long drives across the ranch. The cowboys no longer watched them like prisoners. They treated them like young ranch hands. Of course, the war still existed beyond the horizon of the Texas plains. Letters occasionally arrived with news from overseas. Rumors passed quietly between the guards and ranch workers. Cities destroyed. Armies retreating. And then, one morning in May, the news finally reached the ranch. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. For a moment, the announcement created an unusual silence among the prisoners. Some of the boys stared down at the dusty ground. Others looked out toward the open fields. They had dreamed about this moment for months. The moment when the war would end. The moment they could go home. But the feeling that followed was not what they expected. Because home was no longer a simple idea. Many of their cities were in ruins. Families were scattered. And the life they had known before the war might no longer exist. A few weeks later, new orders arrived. The prisoners would soon be transported back to Europe. On the morning of their departure, trucks once again rolled onto the ranch road. But this time, the boys did not step into them as frightened prisoners. They stood beside the men who had worked with them for nearly a year. Some shook hands awkwardly. Others simply nodded, unsure of what words could possibly capture everything that had changed between them. One of the cowboys pressed a small harmonica into the hand of the German boy who had once sung by the campfire. "Don't forget Texas," he said with a quiet smile. The truck engine started. Slowly, the vehicles pulled away from the ranch. The boys watched the fences, the barn, and the wide Texas sky disappear behind them. Years later, some of those former prisoners would remember something unexpected. In the middle of a brutal war that had divided nations and enemies, a remote cattle ranch had shown them a different truth. Sometimes the smallest acts of decency could challenge everything people had been taught to believe about one another.